This is your host, Danny, and this is Do You Know from English Plus Podcast. In this episode, we're going to talk about the Atlantic Ocean. But before we start, let me proudly announce the launch of English Plus Magazine. English Plus Magazine is out. It is a weekly magazine that you can get if you become a patron of English Plus on Patreon. The link is in the description. And this is not everything. When you become a patron of English Plus, you will also have access to all our premium episodes. If you're just interested in the premium episodes and you prefer to subscribe using Apple Podcasts, you can do that as well. You can subscribe there and have access to all our premium episodes. And now, without further ado, let's start our Do You Know episode for today. If you look at a map of the world, you will see a body of water that runs the length of Earth in a huge S-shaped curve. That is the Atlantic Ocean, the world's second biggest ocean. Only the Pacific Ocean is larger. The Atlantic Ocean separates North and South America from Europe and Africa. In the north, it reaches past Greenland to the Arctic Ocean. In the south, it touches the continent of Antarctica. The middle of the Atlantic is a vast expanse of water. Around its edges, it opens to a number of seas. In the east, you can sail from the Atlantic into the Mediterranean Sea through a tiny opening called the Strait of Gibraltar. In the west, you can sail into the Caribbean Sea and the Gulf of Mexico. Geographers divide the Atlantic Ocean into two parts at the equator, which is the imaginary line that circles Earth around its middle. These parts are the North Atlantic Ocean and the South Atlantic Ocean. So, how did the Atlantic Ocean form? The continents on either side of the Atlantic Ocean look like puzzle pieces that could slide together. Why is this? Millions of years ago, most of the world's land was in two huge continents called Laurasia and Gondwanaland. The two continents then began to split apart, east to west. Water filled the gap between them, creating the Atlantic Ocean. The ocean is still growing larger today. And now let's talk about the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. The rift between the continents is still down there. It runs along an underwater mountain range called the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge is the world's longest mountain system. It extends 9,300 miles or 15,000 kilometers along the ocean floor, north to south. It's loaded with live volcanoes. A deep valley extends along the crest of the ridge. This is where the seafloor spreads. Molten or melted rock rises from beneath Earth's surface. The rock cools and becomes the ocean's new floor. The Atlantic Ocean widens a little over 1 inch or 3 centimeters each year. Now, what about the islands the Atlantic Ocean has? Compared to the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean has very few islands. The largest islands and island groups border the continents. They include the island of Newfoundland and the Caribbean islands off North America. In the far north, a part of Greenland, the world's largest island, reaches into the North Atlantic Ocean. The British Isles make up the largest island group off Europe. Most islands in the middle of the Atlantic are volcanoes. Iceland, the Azores, St. Paul's Rocks, Ascension, and the Tristan da Cunha group all were formed by volcanic action along the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. Now, what about the ocean currents? The surface waters of the Atlantic travel in great circle-shaped currents. They move like rivers within the ocean. Currents in the North Atlantic move clockwise. Those in the South Atlantic move the opposite way. North of the equator, the Gulf Stream current flows south past Europe. It curves west near the equator and then flows north along North America. Near Canada, it curves east again. The current carries warm water north from the Gulf of Mexico. The Brazil current is a similar type of current south of the equator. And finally, the Atlantic Ocean has the busiest sea lanes in the world. More ships cross the North Atlantic than any other ocean. That's because lots of things are made on both sides of the ocean. Countries in Europe trade heavily with those in North America. Much of this trade is done by ship. So that is everything I wanted to share with you about the Atlantic Ocean, and that is our Do You Know episode for today. I hope you like it. I hope you learned things in it that you didn't know about before. Let me remind you again, if you want to have access to our premium episodes, you have two ways. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, and you can become a patron of English Plus Podcast on Patreon. And if you decide to become a patron, you will also receive every issue of our weekly English Plus magazine. Now, with that being said, let me thank you very much for listening to another episode from English Plus Podcast. This is your host, Danny. I will see you next time.